The smell of polished wood and strong coffee hung in the air that morning when I stepped into my son's house. It was supposed to be an ordinary visit, just a Saturday breakfast, a chance to see the grandchildren and sit for a while in the warmth of family. But ordinary days have a way of breaking into pieces when you least expect them. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon, so you never miss a story like this one. I had barely set my coat on the rack when I noticed it. The door to his study left ajar. That in itself wasn't unusual. My son worked long hours, and the study had become more his command post than a quiet corner. But something about the way the light spilled out onto the hallway floor caught me. Papers scattered, not neatly stacked as they always were. I paused at the threshold, listening. The house was alive with sound. My grandchildren's laughter echoing from upstairs, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen where my daughter-in-law moved briskly about. But the study was silent. Curiosity tugged at me. I stepped inside. The desk was littered with folders, half-open envelopes, and sheets spread wide as if someone had left in a hurry. I shouldn't have looked. Maybe I should have closed the door, walked back to the kitchen, and pretended I had seen nothing. But my eyes, trained over years in the Navy to catch small details others missed, fell on one page in particular. My name. It was written in bold at the top of the document, followed by words that turned my stomach cold. Petition for guardianship and control of estate. I leaned closer, my fingers trembling as I touched the edge of the paper. There in black ink was my son's signature. For a moment the room seemed to tilt. The walls, lined with books and certificates, blurred as my mind struggled to process the words. Guardianship, incompetent, estate. Words that didn't belong to me, not after 68 years of standing on my own 2 feet, of leading men through storms at sea, of carrying my family when life pressed hardest. I pulled back, my chest tight, and glanced at the other papers. More documents, legal drafts, notes in my son's handwriting, words like incapacitated, management of funds, no medical evaluation required. It was all there. The outline of a plan to strip me of control, to paint me as a man too old, too fragile, too lost to make my own decisions. A man unfit. I sank into the leather chair by the desk, my hands pressing against my knees. Memories of my wife came rushing back, the promises I had made to her on her deathbed. Take care of him. Make sure he never forgets respect. Had I failed her? Or had he failed us both? The sound of laughter drifted again from upstairs, innocent and bright, colliding painfully with the storm inside me. My grandson had once drawn me a picture, taped it to my fridge. Me standing tall in front of a house, smiling. In his eyes I was still strong, still the man he could trust. But here on these papers I was nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. I gathered the documents, stacking them carefully. My instinct as a sailor, as a strategist, kicked in. Panic was dangerous, action measured and deliberate was survival. As I slid the papers back into their folder, I heard footsteps in the hall. My son's voice carried casual light. Dad, breakfast's ready. I forced my face calm, my voice steady. Coming. I placed the folder exactly where I had found it, the edges aligned, the pages smoothed flat. Then I closed the door quietly behind me. In the kitchen, the smell of eggs and bacon filled the air. My son smiled as though nothing were wrong, pouring me a cup of coffee, asking how I'd slept. My daughter-in-law placed a plate in front of me, her tone overly cheerful. I sat there, nodding, smiling, answering their questions with quiet words. But inside, a different man stirred. The man who had survived storms, who had learned long ago that battles are not always fought with fists or guns. Sometimes the greatest battles begin in silence. And this one, I realized, had already begun. The house was still when I left later that afternoon. My son waved from the porch, his smile practiced, his hand raised in a gesture that looked more like performance than warmth. My daughter-in-law stood beside him, lips curved into a smile too perfect to be real, the kind of smile you hold for photographs. I returned the wave, slid into my truck, and drove off down the street. But the folder I had seen in his study lingered in my mind like smoke you can't clear from your lungs. By the time I reached my own home, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. Shadows stretched long across the yard, and the house felt colder than usual when I stepped inside. I brewed a pot of coffee, poured it into my oldest mug, the one my wife had given me years ago with a chipped handle, and sat at the kitchen table. I couldn't shake it. The words, the signature, my name written like a case file. It wasn't curiosity anymore, it was dread. So I did what I had been trained to do long ago. I replayed everything, detail by detail, as if reconstructing a mission. I closed my eyes and pictured the study. The folders, the papers, the faint scratch of my son's pen where he had signed. I remembered the other pages I had barely glanced at, words like medical evaluation, incompetent, transfer of assets. The weight of it pressed into me. This wasn't carelessness. He hadn't simply left papers lying around. This was deliberate, a plan in motion. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, the bitterness of coffee sharp on my tongue. My son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had taught to fish, the boy I had stood beside at his wedding, had put my name into a document that reduced me to a man unfit to live his own life. And his wife, I had no doubt, was behind much of it. The way she had smiled at me, too sweet, too careful. The way her eyes never softened, only measured. I set the mug down and pressed my hands against the table. I needed clarity, proof. The next morning I drove back. I told myself it was just to visit again, to drop off a tool my son had asked for weeks ago. But truthfully, I needed another look. When I arrived, the house was busy. My daughter-in-law was taking the kids to school, and my son was on a call in the kitchen, his back turned. I slipped down the hall, my steps slow, quiet, and pushed open the study door. The folder was gone from the desk, but the wastebasket beside it overflowed with crumpled drafts. I bent down, pulled one free, smoothed it against my knee. The words leapt out at me. Guardianship petition. Claim of diminished capacity. Another crumpled sheet contained notes in my son's own hand. Examples. Forgetfulness, confusion, financial mismanagement. Examples. He had written examples as if rehearsing lies to make me into something I wasn't. My chest tightened. I wasn't perfect. My knees ached in the morning. My back stiffened if I sat too long. Sometimes I forgot where I left my glasses, but unfit, incompetent? No. I had commanded men in storms that could break a ship in two. I had rebuilt my life after burying my wife. I had lived through too much to be undone by a handful of lies on crumpled paper. I replaced the sheets, careful to leave everything as I found it, and slipped back out before anyone noticed. But the truth weighed on me all the way home. This wasn't paranoia. It was betrayal. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, I took down the photograph of my wife. Her eyes, soft and steady, seemed to look right through me. "You always said he'd need guidance," I whispered, but I didn't think he'd turn against me. The photograph gave no answer, but in its silence I heard her voice again. "Don't let kindness turn into chains." I sat long into the night, the papers burned into my mind. My son wasn't simply planning, he was acting. And if I didn't prepare, if I didn't steady myself the way I had at sea all those years ago, then one day soon I'd wake up to find everything, my house, my savings, my dignity, signed away. This was no longer a fear, It was war. For 2 nights I barely slept. I would sit at the kitchen table long after the fire had died, the mug of coffee growing cold in my hand, staring at the shadows dancing against the walls. Every creak of the house felt heavier. Every memory of my son's smile seemed poisoned now. The papers I had seen weren't a misunderstanding. They weren't misfiled documents or practice forms. They were deliberate. And if I had learned anything in the Navy, it was that hesitation is the first step to defeat. On the 3rd morning, I pulled an old card from my wallet. A number I hadn't dialed in years. David Brooks, a lawyer I'd trusted back when my wife was still alive. He had handled some of our affairs after she passed, estate adjustments, small property disputes, and he had been thorough, discreet. He wasn't flashy like the young lawyers in the city. David was steady, the kind of man who valued silence and precision. I dialed the number. The line clicked, and a familiar voice answered, low and measured. David Brooks. David, it's Jack, I said quietly. I need to see you. Today, if you can. There was a pause, then the sound of paper shuffling. Of course. Come by this afternoon, and Jack, his voice lowered, bring whatever has you calling me. By the time I drove into town, the sky had turned gray, clouds sagging low like they might spill snow any minute. David's office sat in an old brick building on Main Street, the kind of place that had survived decades without needing to change. The brass plate on the door read simply, David Brooks, attorney at law. Inside, the air smelled of paper and leather, the shelves lined with books whose spines bore titles in faded gold. David rose from behind his desk, his hair whiter than I remembered, his glasses perched low on his nose. Jack, he said, gripping my hand firmly, it's been a while. Sit. Tell me what's going on. I lowered myself into the chair, the weight of what I carried heavy on my shoulders. Slowly, carefully, I recounted what I had seen in my son's study. The petition, the signatures, the crumpled drafts. I described the words in my son's own handwriting, examples of incompetence, and the way my daughter-in-law's smile had felt sharper than knives. David listened without interrupting, his pen moving slowly across a yellow legal pad. When I finished, the silence stretched. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Jack, he said at last, what you're describing isn't a mistake. It's a guardianship petition in progress. If they succeed, you lose control of everything. Your estate, your accounts, your decisions. They would decide where you live, how you spend, even your medical care. The words settled in the room like lead. I exhaled slowly. They're already preparing. I saw the drafts. David nodded. Then they're building a case. They'll try to collect evidence, small mistakes, slips of memory, even harmless things. They'll use your age against you. In court, perception matters more than truth. I clenched my fists against my knees. And if they win, you'll be declared incompetent, David said bluntly. They'll control your assets. You'll be at their mercy. The silence that followed was suffocating. For a moment I could hear only the faint hum of the heater, the ticking of a clock on the wall. Finally I asked, what do I do? David leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper, though the office was empty but for us. You don't fight them, head on, not yet. You prepare, quietly. You document everything, every phone call, every draft, every odd behavior. We'll rewrite your trust, make it ironclad, add conditions they cannot meet, respect, duty, gratitude. If they fail, the estate bypasses them completely. I sat back, the weight of his words pressing into me. It felt like standing on the deck of a ship before a storm, the horizon dark and heavy, the air buzzing with what was about to come. David set his pen down. Jack, You survived wars at sea. This isn't different. You don't give them the ground they expect. You make them walk into their own trap. I nodded slowly, the steel beginning to settle back into my chest. Good, David said softly. Then we'll begin. But Jack, he paused, his eyes sharp behind the glasses. Whatever happens, you must stay silent. Let them believe they're winning. Let them write their own undoing. I left his office with the folder tucked under my arm, the winter wind biting against my face. The streets of town bustled with people carrying groceries, children tugging mittens, laughter spilling into the cold air. It all felt distant, muffled, as though I had stepped into a different world, because I had. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was a target, but I had been a soldier once. And soldiers don't crumble when the storm comes. They prepare. The days after my meeting with David felt strangely heavier. Every word my son spoke, every gesture my daughter-in-law made seemed rehearsed, as though they were actors performing in a play I hadn't asked to watch. I noticed it first at dinner. They had invited me over with unusual warmth. My son called me in the afternoon, his tone light, almost too light. Dad, come by tonight. We thought we'd cook your favorite. It struck me because he had never remembered what my favorite was. Not once in 68 years had he cared whether it was meatloaf stew or steak. But that night when I arrived, the kitchen smelled of roast beef, garlic mashed potatoes, and warm bread. My wife's old recipe, one she had passed down to me after years of trial and error. I sat at the table watching them move around me like attendants. My daughter-in-law refilled my glass before it was half empty. My son asked about my back, my knees, even my memory. How are you feeling, Dad? Do you get tired more easily these days, forget things sometimes? His voice was too casual, too careful. I smiled faintly, pushing a fork into the potatoes. Not more than any man my age. He nodded, his eyes flicking briefly toward his wife. A glance so quick most would have missed it, but not me. My years in service had taught me to notice signals. Quiet exchanges, shorthand between co-conspirators. Later, while dessert was served, apple pie, another odd favorite I hadn't mentioned in years. My daughter-in-law leaned close. You know, Dad, she said softly. We've been talking. We just want to make sure you're supported. If things ever got too much for you, bills, papers, medications, we could take that off your plate. Her words dripped with honey, but the weight beneath them was steel. I nodded politely. I can still handle my own. Her smile never faltered, but her eyes narrowed just a touch. I drove home that night in silence, the pie sitting heavy in my stomach. Their sudden kindness wasn't kindness at all. It was strategy. They were trying to build a case to make it seem as though they were the responsible caretakers while I was already slipping. Over the next week, the pattern repeated. Phone calls. Too many. Too frequent. Dad, how are you sleeping? Did you remember your medication? Dad, don't you think it's time we looked at simplifying your accounts? They offered to drive me to appointments. They stopped by with groceries I hadn't asked for. They hovered, circled, smiled. To the outside world it would have looked like love, but to me it was surveillance. I played along, letting their questions roll off me, answering with careful calm. I pretended not to notice when they exchanged those quick glances, when their smiles sharpened for just a second too long. One evening my grandson climbed onto my lap with a crayon drawing clutched in his hand. A crooked house, a sun, 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, standing hand in hand. That's me and you, Grandpa, he said proudly. My throat tightened as I kissed the top of his head. In that moment I realized what was at stake. This wasn't about money alone. It was about legacy. About what would be left in that boy's heart when the dust settled. Would he remember a grandfather stripped of dignity? or a man who stood his ground. That night I sat by the fire and pulled out my old journal. I began to write everything down, dates, times, words spoken, each call, each glance, each too sweet gesture. The record grew line by line, page by page, evidence of a performance they believed convincing. But I knew better. Their kindness was a mask, their concern was a net, and they were laying it tighter every day. The winter wind pressed against the house that night, rattling the old windows like a steady drum. I sat in my chair by the fire, my journal open on my lap, the words from dinner still echoing in my ears. Do you forget things sometimes, Dad? We just want to support you. Concern wrapped in velvet, hiding the blade beneath. I closed the journal, placed the pen across its spine, and stared into the flames. The orange glow danced, rising and falling, reminding me of nights decades earlier, nights spent at sea when the deck pitched under my feet, and the horizon was nothing but black water and sky. I had been a Navy man. My life had been built on storms, on long nights of silence, on strategies designed not to meet the enemy head-on, but to outlast him. We had been taught again and again, don't fight where the enemy wants you. Control the battlefield. Force them into your terms. Those words had carried me through more than one storm. And now, staring into the fire, I realized they had come back for a reason. This wasn't about fists or shouting matches. My son and his wife wanted me to react. They wanted me angry, confused, stumbling. They wanted to point a finger in a courtroom and say, look, see how unstable he is? I would not give them that. Instead, I would prepare. Quietly, calmly, like I had done when a storm threatened to tear a ship apart. We didn't scream into the wind. We braced the lines. We studied the maps. We acted only when the moment was right. I rose from my chair, walked to the small desk in my living room, and pulled out an old wooden box. Inside were reminders of the man I had been. Medals dulled with age, photographs in black and white. Letters from my wife tucked carefully between folded flags. At the bottom lay a small leather notebook, edges frayed, pages yellowed. My Navy journal. I opened it, running my fingers over the words written by a younger man. Notes on tactics, weather patterns, lessons from commanders long gone. One line caught my eye, written in my own sharp script. Patience is the shield. Silence is the blade. I let the words sink in. That would be my way. The next morning I began adjusting my routine. I didn't announce it. I didn't change so much that anyone outside could notice. But I started rising earlier, walking the property with sharper eyes, keeping records of everything. I balanced my accounts twice, then left deliberate notes in places they might see. Proof that my mind was clear, precise. When my son called, I answered warmly, even letting him lead the conversation. When my daughter-in-law asked about my health, I chuckled and told her about the miles I still walked each day. They thought they were testing me, but I was testing them. In the evenings, I returned to David's office. We worked quietly, building a wall they didn't know existed, a revised trust, clauses they could never meet, respect, gratitude, duty. And I wrote letters, quiet letters sealed and stored away, addressed to people they wouldn't expect. Neighbors, doctors, community leaders, men and women who knew me, who could testify to my mind, my strength, my independence. Allies hidden in plain sight. Every step I took, I thought of my wife. She had once told me, Jack, you can be kind, but don't be blind. Sometimes love makes us overlook what's right in front of us. I hadn't listened then, but I was listening now. By the time another week passed, I felt the steel return to my spine. My knees still ached in the mornings and my back still stiffened when I stood too long, but inside the old sailor was awake again. The one who had navigated storms without compass, who had trusted silence more than shouting, patience more than panic. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was war. And I was ready to fight it, not with fists, not with rage, but with silence, discipline, and the one thing they didn't believe I still had. A soldier's mind, David's office became my harbor. While the world outside spun with its usual rhythm, children running across sidewalks, cars honking in traffic, laughter spilling from the diner. Inside that room, silence reigned, broken only by the scratch of David's pen and the steady tick of the old brass clock on his shelf. We met 3 times in 1 week, always quietly, always discreet. I parked in the back, away from the street where familiar faces might wander. Inside, I carried no folder, no obvious papers. David provided everything. I would leave with nothing but memory and resolve. The desk between us was always covered with drafts. Sheets of paper layered like the deck of a ship. Wills, trusts, legal notes. Every page held words sharper than any weapon I'd carried in uniform. "Jack," David said one evening, sliding a page toward me, "this is the backbone. If respect and gratitude are not upheld, if you're dismissed, belittled, or treated as incompetent without due cause, the inheritance dissolves." I read the words carefully. They weren't flowery, they weren't vague, they were iron. "And where does it go?" I asked, my voice low. "If they fail?" "To the trustee you appoint," David replied. "You can direct it anywhere, charities, scholarships, even a foundation. Whoever you choose, it will skip them entirely." I tapped the paper, the edge of my finger trembling slightly. "Then it won't go to them. Not unless they remember who I am." David nodded. "Good. And we'll build safeguards. Medical affidavits from your doctors confirming you are of sound mind. Witnesses who know you. Community members who can vouch for your clarity. If they argue incompetence, they'll run straight into a wall of proof." For hours we refined the details. Clauses were added, language tightened. Respect, gratitude, duty. 3 pillars. Break one and the fortune crumbled beneath them. By the 3rd session, I sat back in my chair, weary but steadier than I had felt in weeks. "This isn't revenge," I murmured. "No," David said. "It's protection and it's justice. They wrote you off, Jack, but the law won't." I stared at the final draft, the ink still wet in places. My wife's face flickered in my memory, her soft smile, the way her hand rested on mine during long nights when worry pressed heavy. She had been the one to first insist on conditions when her father's estate passed through to us years ago. I had thought it unnecessary then. Now I knew it had been foresight. When the papers were signed, notarized, and sealed, David leaned back, his glasses catching the lamplight. "Now," he said, "you wait. Don't show your hand. Don't confront them. Let them walk themselves deeper. When the time comes, the trap will, close on its own." I left his office with the winter wind biting at my face, but my chest felt lighter. For the first time since that day in my son's study, I wasn't walking blindly. I had a map. I had a plan. That night, back in my kitchen, I placed my journal beside the fire and wrote one final note at the end of the day's record. "The net they cast will be the one they fall into." I closed the book, staring at the flames until my eyes blurred. For years I had given. For years I had endured. But now I wasn't waiting to be taken apart piece by piece. I was ready. The hardest part of any mission isn't the storm itself. It's the waiting. That's what I told myself as I began my new routine. I didn't storm into their house and demand answers. I didn't show them the documents David and I had prepared. Instead, I chose silence, and something even more difficult for a man like me. I chose to look weaker than I was. The first time I let it happen was at dinner. My son had invited me again the way he'd been doing more often lately under the pretense of family time. We sat at the table, my grandchildren laughing in the background, my daughter-in-law serving with her carefully rehearsed smile. Halfway through the meal, I set my fork down and frowned faintly. "What's wrong, Dad?" my son asked. "I can't remember what I was saying," I murmured, my brow furrowed, eyes cast low. It was an act, a small slip, but enough. My daughter-in-law's eyes sharpened instantly. She leaned forward, her voice sweet but tinged with calculation. "That's okay, Dad. It happens to everyone. Maybe we should help you keep track of things. Write them down, maybe?" I smiled faintly, nodding. Maybe. Inside, my stomach turned. I had seen the hunger behind her eyes, not concern, opportunity. Over the next weeks, I let the performance grow. I forgot where I parked the truck once, waiting a full 5 minutes before unlocking it with the remote in my pocket. I misplaced my glasses even though they were right on the table. I let my son repeat things back to me as if I hadn't heard them the first time. Every slip, every pause I recorded later in my journal with one note in the margin. Observed their reaction, and they always reacted the same. My son's tone carried more patience than usual, but also condescension. My daughter-in-law masked her eagerness behind concern, her hand on my arm a second longer than necessary, her smile just wide enough to sell the act to anyone watching. But I wasn't just anyone. I was their father. And I had known them long enough to tell when words hid knives. One evening I let the act slip further. I stood at the sink after dinner rinsing a dish and let it slip from my hands. It shattered against the floor, porcelain scattering across the tiles. "Oh, Dad!" my son exclaimed, rushing forward. "Careful, you could have cut yourself." My daughter-in-law didn't hide her reaction this time. She exchanged a quick glance with him, her lips tightening in a smile that looked almost victorious. I caught it, and I knew then. The act was working. That night I drove home slowly, the road long and dark. My hands gripped the wheel tight, my chest aching with a strange mix of triumph and sorrow. It's a terrible thing for a father to watch his own son wait for him to fall. But it was necessary. Let them think I was crumbling. Let them believe their case was growing stronger. Every note they made, every concerned word they spoke only built the wall higher. And when the time came, that wall would collapse on them. Not on me. I sat by the fire that night, my wife's photograph on the mantel above me. Her eyes seemed to hold mine, calm and knowing. "You'd hate this," I whispered. "You'd hate to see me pretending to be weak. But this is the only way to show what they are." The photograph, as always, gave no reply, but the silence felt like approval. I opened my journal and wrote the last line of the night. "They think I am slipping. Let them. A storm always looks calm until it breaks." It was a Sunday afternoon when the invitation came. "Dad," my son said over the phone, his tone unusually bright. "We're having a small get-together. Just family. You should come." There was no hesitation in my answer. Of course. I hung up and sat for a while, staring at the quiet room around me. These invitations had become more frequent, and each time they arrived, I knew it wasn't for love or closeness. It was for observation. They wanted to study me, how I walked, how I talked, how often I stumbled. But this time, I had a feeling the cracks would show on their side, not mine. When I arrived, the house was buzzing. My grandchildren ran through the hall with laughter spilling after them, their joy untouched by the tension simmering among the adults. My daughter-in-law greeted me at the door, her smile wide, her hands warm as she squeezed mine. "So glad you came," she said, the sweetness in her tone just a little too forced. I nodded, stepping inside. The dining room table was already set. Candles lit though the sun hadn't yet set. Plates gleamed, wine glasses sparkled, and the smell of roasted chicken filled the air. As the meal began, conversation flowed easily enough, about school, about the weather, about plans for the holidays. But then, like a fisherman easing a hook into water, my daughter-in-law steered the conversation. "So, Dad," she began, her eyes fixed on me, "have you been keeping up with your bills? It must be hard managing all that paperwork." I chewed slowly, set my fork down, and smiled faintly. "It's not too hard." My son leaned in, his expression carefully sympathetic. "We just worry sometimes. You've been forgetting little things lately. It's nothing to be ashamed of." The words hung heavy over the table. The children went quiet, sensing something they didn't understand. I let the silence stretch, then chuckled softly. "I suppose we all forget now and then." Their eyes met across the table, a silent exchange passing between them. It was the look of people who thought they had won a point, scored another tally mark for their case. Later, while the plates were being cleared, the masks slipped further. My daughter-in-law stood in the kitchen doorway, speaking in a low voice she thought I couldn't hear. "If we push a little harder, he'll slip in front of everyone. We need witnesses." I froze in place, the words cutting deep. Witnesses. They weren't just trying to convince a court with papers. They wanted others, family, friends, to see me falter, to testify against me. I walked into the kitchen quietly, my steps steady, my expression calm. She spun around, startled, her smile snapping back into place. "More pie, Dad?" she asked, her tone dripping with sugar. I nodded, taking the plate she offered. But as I walked back to the table, I knew something had shifted. They were no longer just planning. They were hunting. The evening ended with polite hugs and cheerful goodbyes. My son clapped me on the shoulder, his voice warm but his eyes calculating. "Take care, Dad. We'll check on you soon." When I got home, I sat by the fire, the weight of the day pressing heavy on me. I opened my journal and wrote, "They want me to break in public. They want witnesses to my downfall. But storms don't break ships when the captain holds the wheel steady." I closed the journal, my resolve sharper than it had ever been. They thought they were tightening their case, but all they were doing was showing their true faces and giving me everything I needed to sink their plan. The breaking point wasn't mine. It was theirs. The days that followed the family dinner were strangely calm. On the surface, life moved forward as if nothing had happened. My son still called now and then with his practiced warmth. My daughter-in-law still wore her carefully painted smile when I came around. To anyone else, it might have looked like family harmony, but I had heard the whisper. "We need witnesses." And once you hear the truth slip from a mask, you never unhear it. That night I opened my journal and began a new section. Evidence. Every call, every visit, every word that felt rehearsed. I wrote it all down with times, dates, and exact phrasing. Years in the Navy had taught me discipline. Reports had to be precise, accurate. Details could save lives. Now those same habits would save my dignity. The first trail came from their finances. David had advised me to look not at what they said, but at what they did. My son and his wife had lived large, cars, vacations, galas, all paid for by accounts that had swelled since my wife's inheritance. But in the past months, withdrawals had grown erratic, investments hasty. David placed a stack of bank statements on his desk one afternoon, sliding them toward me. "See here." Transfers in their names. Loans signed without collateral. They're bleeding money faster than they admit. I studied the pages, my hands steady. "So that's why they need my estate." "Exactly," David said, his voice low. "They've spent what they had. Now they want control of what you've built." The second trail came from my own house. I began noticing subtle intrusions. A drawer left open when I knew I'd shut it. papers slightly shifted, my medicine bottles turned in the cabinet. They were looking for evidence, for mistakes. So I gave them nothing. Every document was double-filed, every receipt copied. My checkbook balanced down to the last cent. I left nothing for them to twist, nothing for them to claim as confusion. But I didn't stop there. I placed a small tape recorder in my coat pocket during dinners. Harmless, discreet. It captured their questions. Do you forget often? Are you sure you paid that bill? Words dipped in sugar but sharp enough to cut in court. Each recording I stored safely with David, labeled and sealed. One night after another concerned visit where my daughter-in-law asked if I needed help remembering appointments. I drove straight to David's office. He listened to the recording in silence, then leaned back in his chair. "This is gold," he said. "Their tone, their wording, it shows intent. They're not supporting you, they're building a narrative." We added it to the growing file. By the end of the month, the file was thick. My journal entries, financial records, overheard conversations, recordings. Each piece alone might not have been enough, but together they painted a picture clearer than glass. Manipulation, deceit, exploitation. One evening I sat at my desk at home, the fire low, the stack of copies spread before me. My wife's photograph watched from the mantel. "You see this?" I whispered. "They think they're clever, but they're building their own gallows." Her silence felt approving, her memory steadying my hand as I organized the pages into neat piles. For years I had believed love was enough, that a father's heart could carry a family even when respect wavered. But respect once gone leaves behind only hunger, hunger for control, for power. And hunger devours itself. I closed the folder and leaned back, exhaustion pressing into my bones. But it wasn't the weariness of defeat. It was the steady fatigue of preparation, the kind that comes before the storm breaks when you've secured the lines and braced the deck, waiting for the first wave to strike. Because now, I was ready. And when they stepped into court, they would discover the truth. The paper trail they thought would bury me was the very rope that would hang them. The courthouse smelled of old wood and colder judgment. Its walls had stood for more than 100 years, and every creak of the benches, every echo of shoes on the marble floor carried the weight of lives decided inside. I sat in the back row at first, my hat in my hands, my heart steady but heavy. This wasn't the Navy. There were no storms rolling across the sea, no enemy ships on the horizon. But the stakes felt heavier. This wasn't about survival in a storm. This was about survival in dignity. At the front, my son sat beside his wife. His suit was pressed, his tie knotted just right, but the nerves flickered in the way he tugged at his cufflink, the way his eyes darted toward me and away again. She, on the other hand, sat stiff and sharp, her chin lifted, her lips pressed tight, her eyes cold. The judge entered, and the room rose, the shuffle of feet loud in the silence. When everyone sat again, the clerk read the case. Petition for guardianship and control of estate, Jack, respondent. My name spoken like a case file. My son rose, his voice steady, rehearsed. Your Honor, my father has reached an age where he can no longer care for his financial affairs. He's forgetful, confused. We've witnessed lapses that put his well-being and estate at risk. We only want to ensure he's cared for. His wife nodded solemnly, placing a hand over his as if sealing the words with her performance. The judge turned toward me. Mr. Jack, do you have representation? Before I could rise, David Brooks stood from the opposite table. Calm, steady, his presence filled the room without raising his voice. Yes, Your Honor. I represent Mr. Jack. My son's head snapped toward me, shock flickering across his face. My daughter-in-law's lips tightened. David adjusted his glasses, his tone measured as he began. Your Honor, we intend to demonstrate not only that my client is fully competent, but that this petition was filed in bad faith, motivated by financial desperation and manipulation. The words fell heavy. My son shifted in his chair, his voice louder now, less steady. That's not true. We only want to protect him. David opened a folder, the same folder I had helped build page by page. Then let's look at the facts. He laid out my journal entries first, each page dated, times noted, handwriting steady. He presented medical affidavits from my doctors confirming I was of sound mind, physically and mentally capable. He played audio recordings of dinners where concerns were pressed into me like needles. Questions crafted not for care but for performance. And then came the financial records, their loans, their withdrawals, their unpaid bills. Your Honor, David said calmly, this petition is not about care. It is about access. My client's son and daughter-in-law have lived far beyond their means, drained their resources, and now seek to seize his under false pretenses. The courtroom was silent except for the shuffle of papers. The judge leaned back, studying the pile before him. My son's face had gone pale, his wife's mask cracking into anger. She leaned toward him, whispering sharply, but her words carried across the quiet room. Fix this. Now! He rose again, his voice shaking. He's pretending. He's only acting strong because he knew this was coming. David didn't flinch. Acting strong, Your Honor, doesn't produce steady financial ledgers, medical clearance, or this. He tapped the recordings. What this shows is intent, a deliberate attempt to create a false narrative. The judge looked at me then. Mr. Jack, is there anything you'd like to say? I rose slowly, my hands steady on the bench before me. My voice was quiet, but it carried. I've lived 68 years. I served my country, I buried my wife, I raised my son. I've earned the right to stand on my own 2 feet until I can't anymore. Respect was all I ever asked. And when respect was denied, all that remained was betrayal. That's what you see here today. I sat again, the silence of the room wrapping around me like armor. The judge cleared his throat, his eyes steady. I'll review this case carefully, but let me be clear. Guardianship is not a tool for greed. It is a responsibility for care. If this petition was filed with ill intent, consequences will follow. The gavel struck once, echoing through the chamber. My son's shoulders slumped, his wife's face twisted, and for the first time I saw not confidence but fear in their eyes. The courthouse was quieter when we reconvened the following week. The first hearing had shaken the ground beneath my son and his wife, but arrogance doesn't crumble overnight. They had come back dressed sharper, their words rehearsed again, their eyes darting with the nervous confidence of people who still believed money and performance could win them the day. I sat beside David, my hat resting on my lap. My heart beat steady. The file in front of us wasn't just paper. It was the weight of every sacrifice I had made, every night I had stayed awake to protect what my wife and I had built. The judge called us to order and the case resumed. My son rose quickly. His voice trembled at first but steadied with practice. Your Honor, with respect, my father has staged these displays. He's clever, but it's all an act. We're simply trying to ensure he doesn't harm himself or lose everything through mistakes he won't admit. His wife nodded vigorously beside him, her eyes sharp. We love him. We only want what's best for him. The judge's eyes narrowed. And yet the financial records suggest otherwise. Their faces froze, but before they could answer, David stood. Calm as ever, he adjusted his glasses and spoke with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his words were about to strike. Your Honor, last week we demonstrated that Mr. Jack is fully competent, medically, financially, and personally. Today we will show that not only is he competent, but that his estate is already protected by a trust that leaves no room for manipulation. He opened the folder and laid out the documents. This trust, executed and notarized prior to the filing of this petition, includes ironclad conditions: respect, gratitude, duty to family. If those conditions are broken, the inheritance dissolves. It cannot be seized through guardianship. It cannot be twisted for personal gain. It is the law. He slid the papers forward. The courtroom was silent but for the shuffle of the clerk examining them. My son leaned forward, his face pale. What does that mean? David turned his gaze toward him, his voice steady but sharp. It means you've already broken every condition that mattered. The petition you filed, the manipulation, the neglect of respect. You've disqualified yourselves. Legally, the inheritance bypasses you. Completely. The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water, rippling outward, impossible to ignore. My daughter-in-law's mask cracked first. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, standing abruptly. He can't just change everything without telling us." David's tone was even. "He doesn't need to tell you. It is his right, his estate, his decision. And he chose wisely." The judge held up a hand, silencing the room. He skimmed the documents, his brow furrowed. At last he spoke. "These clauses are binding. This trust is clear. The petition before me not only fails, but it exposes the petitioner's motives as self-serving." My son sat back heavily, his face drained of color. His wife gripped his arm, her nails digging in, whispering furiously. But the fight had left her eyes. I sat still, my breath slow, my hands calm against my knees. I hadn't spoken a word, yet everything had been said. The judge looked at me, his expression firm. "Mr. Jack, you remain in full control of your affairs. Your estate is secure under the law. This case is dismissed." The gavel struck once, the echo filling the chamber like a final drumbeat. I glanced toward my son one last time. He looked at me with a mix of rage and something else. Something almost like shame. But shame without change is just another mask. I stood, tipped my hat to the judge, and walked out with David at my side. In the hallway, the world felt wider, the air sharper. David placed a hand on my shoulder. "You've done more than defend yourself, Jack. You've honored your wife's foresight. And you've shown them what silence and preparation can do." I nodded, my throat tight. For the first time in months, I felt something lift. Not joy, not triumph, but peace. They had thought me weak. They had thought me blind. But the revelation was clear now. They had never truly known the man they were trying to destroy. News travels faster in small towns than the wind itself. By the time I reached home that afternoon, word of the dismissal had already seeped into the cracks of the community. The diner, the post office, the church pews, whispers carried like smoke. They tried to strip him of his dignity. Filed against their own father, can you believe it? And the court threw it right out. Justice, plain and simple. I sat on my porch that evening, the fireflies blinking faint in the dusk, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. But beneath that quiet was a current I couldn't ignore. My son and his wife had built themselves on image, on suits, on cars, on galas, on handshakes that promised more than they could deliver. Now that image was cracking and everyone was watching. The first signs of their fall came within days. I passed their house one afternoon and the driveway was bare. The glossy car that had once sat gleaming under the sun was gone. Repossessed, I would learn later. The front gate sagged, unlatched, weeds pushing up through the gravel drive. At the diner, I overheard men shaking their heads over unpaid invoices. "He owes the contractor for 6 months. Can't pay a dime." One woman whispered over her coffee. "She promised a donation to the children's hospital. The check bounced." It spread further each day. The crumbling of their perfect facade. A week later, I saw my daughter-in-law at the grocery store. Her cart was half full, but when she reached the register, the card was declined. Once, twice. She didn't look anyone in the eye as she left the cart behind and walked out, her cheeks pale, her steps quick. My son fared no better. I found him once outside the bank, standing with his head bowed as a teller shook his hand politely but firmly. When he looked up and saw me across the street, his face shifted. Anger, shame, desperation, all in one flicker. He turned away before I could raise a hand. But it was Sunday at church when the true collapse showed itself. They arrived late, slipping into a pew at the back. No heads turned to greet them this time. No hands reached out to shake theirs. During the sermon, the pastor's voice carried heavier than usual. When pride builds palaces on sand, the tide will wash them away. Respect is not optional, gratitude is not weakness, duty cannot be bought with silver. The words weren't pointed, but everyone knew where they landed. My son sat stiff, his wife's jaw clenched, their eyes locked on the floor. And I simply bowed my head, my hand resting on the worn Bible that had belonged to my wife. I didn't need to look at them. Their downfall was not my victory, it was simply justice. That evening, as I sat at home, I heard the crunch of gravel outside. My grandson stepped hesitantly onto the porch, his backpack slung over one shoulder. His eyes were wide, uncertain, but his voice was soft. "Grandpa, can I stay here tonight?" I opened the door without a word, pulling him inside. He set his things down, looking around at the warmth of the fire, the simple table, the quiet safety of the house. His shoulders relaxed. We sat together, sharing supper. Bread, soup, nothing fancy. He spoke little, but when he finished, he slipped a crayon drawing from his bag. Another house, another pair of figures, one tall, one small. "This one's us," he said. I swallowed hard, the weight of it pressing into me deeper than anything that had happened in that courtroom. In that moment, I understood what collapse really meant. It wasn't the loss of cars or houses, it wasn't bounced checks or whispers in the diner. Collapse was what happened when you built your life on pride and forgot the pillars of respect, gratitude, and duty, and their collapse was complete. The house was quiet that night, the fire crackling low as I sat in my chair with my grandson asleep in the spare room down the hall. His soft breathing carried faintly through the stillness, steady and innocent, like the rhythm of a tide against the shore. I held my wife's photograph in my hand, tracing the frame with my thumb. For years, this house had felt too empty without her, each creak of the floorboards echoing in ways that reminded me of what I had lost. But tonight, the emptiness didn't feel so hollow. Tonight there was life again. Small footsteps, a child's laughter, crayons scattered across the table. I whispered to the photograph. "He's safe here. He's loved. That's what matters." The clock ticked on, slow and steady. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and cold earth. Then the silence broke. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. I glanced down, expecting perhaps a message from David or one of the neighbors. But the name on the screen made my chest tighten. My son. The message appeared in fragments, each line more desperate than the last. "Dad, we need to talk. She's furious, everything's falling apart. I didn't know it would end this way. Please, I need help." I stared at the screen, the glow painting the room in cold light. My hands didn't shake. My breathing didn't quicken. I simply sat there, letting the weight of those words press against me. For years, I had been the answer to his every problem. For years, I had carried burdens that weren't mine, paid debts that weren't mine, and absorbed blame that wasn't mine. He had never asked with respect, only with expectation. And when he tried to strip me of dignity, it wasn't because he didn't know better. It was because he thought he would never face the storm, but now he had, and it wasn't mine to weather anymore. I set the phone face down on the table. The silence returned heavier, deeper. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt final. My grandson stirred in the other room, mumbling softly in his sleep. I rose, walked quietly to his door, and stood watching him for a moment. He had curled into the blanket, his small fist clutching the drawing he had given me earlier. 2 stick figures hand in hand, standing under a sun that seemed too big for the paper. That was my legacy. Not cars, not houses, not accounts in a bank ledger, but love passed forward, respect taught, gratitude lived. I whispered into the dark, words meant for no one but myself. Some storms you fight, some you survive, and some you walk away from. Back in the living room, I placed my wife's photograph on the mantel and sat once more. The fire was fading now, embers glowing low, but it was enough. The phone buzzed again. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. Because sometimes the loudest answer you can give is silence. And silence was mine. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon. And so you never miss another story like this one. Thank you for listening.